When he said it, he didn't even raise his voice. That was the worst part. He stood near the window, arms crossed, looking past me, not at me, and said, "Pack your things. You won't be living here anymore. I have my own family and my own life." The words landed softly, almost politely, but they cut deeper than any scream could have. For a moment I thought I had misheard him. Old ears, tired mind. I waited for him to smile, to say he was joking, to turn back into the little boy who used to hide behind my skirt when thunder frightened him. But he didn't. He checked his phone instead. I looked around the room that had slowly become mine without ever truly belonging to me. The chair by the wall. The small shelf with my folded sweaters. The cup I always use for tea because it didn't burn my fingers. None of it felt real anymore. It was as if I had been living here on borrowed time, and someone had finally checked the clock. I wanted to ask him when this decision was made. Last night? Last year? Or had it always been there, quietly growing while I cooked dinners and folded laundry, pretending not to notice how little space I took in his life? My hands began to shake, so I hid them in my lap. I didn't cry. Not yet. I felt something colder than tears spreading inside my chest. A heavy understanding that I was no longer a mother here, only a problem that needed solving. He cleared his throat and said something about how this was best for everyone. Everyone except the woman sitting right in front of him. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I suddenly felt very, very old. After he left the room, the silence became loud. I could hear the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking, the house breathing as if nothing important had happened. Only I felt different, like a guest who had stayed too long and finally been noticed. I sat there for a long time, staring at the door he had closed behind him. I wondered if he felt relieved after saying it. Maybe the words had been heavy inside him, waiting for the right moment to fall. Or maybe they were light, rehearsed, easy to throw away. I would never know. My eyes drifted to my hands. These hands once lifted him when he was sick, washed his small clothes in cold water, counted coins to buy him shoes that didn't leak in the rain. I remembered how he used to wrap his fingers around mine, afraid to cross the street alone. Now those same hands were no longer needed. They had finished their work. I told myself not to be dramatic. People move on. Children grow up. That is the natural order. But there was a difference between growing up and pushing someone out of the door. Between living your own life and erasing the one who gave you yours. I stood up slowly and walked to the small room where I slept. It wasn't really a room, more like a corner with a bed. I opened the wardrobe and looked at my clothes. So few things. It shocked me how easily my life could fit into 2 bags. Years of living reduced to fabric and buttons. As I folded a sweater, I suddenly remembered knitting it late at night years ago, while waiting for him to come home. I smiled at the memory, then stopped. Smiling felt wrong now, like a betrayal of the pain settling deep in my bones. I realized then that I wasn't packing just my things. I was packing my place in his life. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the narrow bed, listening to the house settle, to footsteps upstairs, to quiet laughter that wasn't meant for me. His family moving on with their evening, while my life was being carefully folded into silence. At some point I heard him open the fridge. The familiar sound made my chest tighten. I used to wake up early just to prepare his breakfast, even when he was already grown. It was my way of saying I'm still here. Now I wondered if he even noticed when the table stayed empty. I thought about speaking to him again, about asking why now, about reminding him of winters when the heating barely worked, and I slept in my coat so he wouldn't feel cold, about nights when I skipped meals so he could eat more. But I stopped myself. Love that needs to beg is no longer love, it is humiliation. In the dark, memories came uninvited. His first steps. His fevered forehead under my palm. His voice calling for me in the night. I remembered promising myself that as long as I lived, he would never feel alone. Funny how promises only bind one side. I turned my face to the wall and finally let the tears come. Quiet tears, careful tears. I didn't want anyone to hear them. Crying felt like proof that I still expected something from him. An apology, regret, maybe even a second thought. But the house remained silent. No door opened. No voice called my name. By morning my eyes were swollen and my heart felt heavier. But something inside me had hardened. Thin shell maybe. Necessary for survival. I washed my face, straightened my clothes, and looked at my reflection in the mirror. An old woman looked back at me, tired, pale, but standing. I whispered to her, "You will get through this." Not because I believed it completely, but because no one else would say it for me. When I stepped out of the room, the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a place I was already leaving. He avoided me in the morning. I could tell by the way he stayed upstairs longer than usual, by how carefully the doors were closed. Avoidance is a language too, and I understood it well. It said, "Don't make this harder," as if it wasn't already heavy enough. I made myself tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I once helped him with homework, where his small fingers traced letters while I corrected them gently. The chair across from me was empty now, and for the first time I noticed how wide the table was. Too wide for one person. I looked around, searching for signs that I had truly lived here. There were none. No photographs of me on the walls. No objects that said "she belongs." Only clean surfaces in someone else's life carefully arranged. I realized then that I had been slowly erased long before he spoke those words. The sentence was only the final stroke. When he finally came down, he spoke about practical things. Where I could go. How long I had. What would be easier for everyone. His voice was calm, almost kind, and that kindness hurt more than anger would have. It made my pain seem unreasonable, exaggerated. I nodded again. I was doing that a lot. Nodding had become my shield. If I didn't argue, if I didn't cry, maybe I could leave with what little dignity I had left. At one point he paused, as if waiting for me to say something. Maybe he hoped I would make it easier for him. That I would say I understood. That I would forgive him without being asked. But all I could think was how strange it felt to be spoken to like a stranger. Like someone he once knew long ago and no longer recognized. I finished my tea and stood up carefully. My legs felt weak, but my back stayed straight. I thought, if this is the moment I disappear from his life, I will not do it bent over. As I walked away from the table, I felt something settle inside me. A quiet decision. I would leave, yes, but I would take my self-respect with me. I began sorting my things that afternoon slowly, as if time might soften if I treated it gently. Each drawer I opened felt like a small confession. I had never truly unpacked my life here. I had lived carefully, quietly, afraid to take up too much space. Now I understood why. Somewhere inside me, I had always known this moment could come. I placed my belongings on the bed one by one. A worn scarf. A small box with old letters tied by a faded ribbon. Pills lined up like obedient soldiers. Objects carry memories, and every memory seemed heavier than the last. I had to sit down more than once, pressing my hand against my chest, waiting for the tightness to ease. At the bottom of the drawer I found a photograph. It was old, the edges soft, colors nearly gone. I was young in it, my hair dark, my eyes hopeful. I was holding him. A baby wrapped in a blanket too big for his body. I remembered that day clearly. I had been scared, exhausted, but so sure that everything I gave would matter. I stared at the photo for a long time, wondering when certainty turns into illusion. When love becomes an obligation people want to escape from. I didn't blame the baby in the picture. I blamed the years that teach children to forget. I folded the photo carefully and placed it in my bag, not with sadness, but with something closer to acceptance. Some memories are not meant to be shared. They are meant to be carried alone. From the hallway I heard laughter again. His life continuing smoothly without pause. I realized then that my leaving would not leave a hole. I was not being removed, I was being replaced by comfort, by convenience. That thought should have broken me. Instead it brought a strange calm. If I was no longer needed here, then perhaps it was time to find a place where my presence didn't require justification. I closed the bag and sat beside it, breathing slowly. This was not the end of my life. Only the end of living where I was no longer wanted. That evening, he told me I should be gone within a few days. Not urgently, he said, but firmly, like someone setting a reminder on a calendar. A deadline for my existence in his space. I listened carefully, memorizing his tone more than his words. It was the voice of a man who had already moved on. I asked him where he thought I should go. The question seemed to surprise him. He hesitated, then mentioned places in a vague way, options, arrangements, facilities. None of them sounded like homes. They sounded like storage for lives that no longer fit anywhere else. I nodded again. Inside, something tightened, not with fear, but with a dull disappointment. I had imagined, foolishly, that he might say you can stay until you find something, or we'll figure it out together. Instead, he spoke like someone closing a chapter he no longer wanted to reread. Later, alone in my corner of the house, I tried to imagine myself elsewhere. A small room. A shared hallway. Unfamiliar faces. The thought frightened me, but not as much as staying where I was unwanted. Rejection leaves a deeper scar when it comes slowly, wrapped in politeness. I touched the wall beside my bed, tracing a crack I had noticed months ago. I remembered thinking I should tell him about it. I never did. Felt unimportant then. Funny how quickly everything becomes unimportant once your place disappears. That night, I whispered goodbye to the room. Not out loud, only inside myself. I thanked it for shelter, for warmth, even for the pain that taught me clarity. As I lay down, I realized something quietly powerful. I was afraid of being alone, but I was more afraid of being tolerated. And so, for the first time since his words shattered my world, I felt the smallest shift inside me. Not hope yet, but readiness. The next morning, I stepped outside for a short walk. The air was cold, sharp enough to wake my thoughts. I wrapped my scarf tighter and moved slowly, feeling the ground beneath my feet as if I needed proof that I still existed somewhere solid. Neighbors passed by, nodding politely. None of them knew that I was already half gone. As I walked, I remembered the first place I ever lived on my own. It was small, noisy, and imperfect, but it was mine. I had been young then, tired but hopeful. I carried that memory like a fragile glass, careful not to drop it, afraid it would shatter under the weight of the present. I sat on a bench and watched people hurry past, all of them going somewhere, all of them belonging somewhere. I wondered when belonging became such a luxury. No one tells you that one day you might have to earn the right to stay, even in your own child's life. When I returned to the house, he wasn't there. The silence felt different now, lighter, almost relieving. I moved through the rooms without fear of being seen. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine leaving without asking permission, without waiting for approval. I opened my bag again and rearranged my things, discarding what I didn't need. Old habits die hard. Even now, I didn't want to be a burden. Not to anyone. Not even to myself. As I folded my clothes, I caught my reflection in the window. My face looked older than yesterday, but also calmer. Pain was still there, deep and aching, but it no longer screamed. It had learned to sit quietly beside me. I realized then that something important was happening. I was no longer waiting for him to change his mind. I was preparing myself to move forward, alone, yes, but on my own terms. For the first time since that sentence was spoken, I felt a strange, unfamiliar strength. Not given to me by anyone. Grown quietly inside me. That afternoon, I received a phone call from a distant relative I hadn't spoken to in years. Word travels quickly when someone decides you no longer belong. The voice on the other end was careful, full of pauses and polite concern. She spoke about places, about availability, about how these things happen. I thanked her, even though each word felt like another door closing gently in my face. After the call, I sat by the window and watched the sky darken. Clouds moved slowly, unbothered by human decisions. I envied them. They never had to explain why they stayed or where they went next. I thought about calling him into the room, about telling him I was scared. Not dramatically, just honestly. I imagined saying, I don't know where I'll go. But the image faded quickly. Fear once shown cannot be taken back. And I did not want my last memory in this house to be one of pleading. Instead, I made myself soup. Simple, quiet work. Cutting vegetables steadied my hands. The smell filled the kitchen, familiar and comforting. For a moment, I almost felt useful again. Then I remembered that usefulness was the very thing that had expired. When he came home, he noticed the soup and thanked me. Just that, thank you. Not how are you? Not are you managing? Gratitude without care is a strange thing. It acknowledges effort while ignoring the person behind it. We ate in silence. Across from me sat the man I once taught to hold a spoon. Now he held his phone more often than my gaze. I studied his face, searching for traces of the boy I loved. There were some, faint and distant, like reflections in old glass. That night, as I lay down, I accepted a truth I had been resisting. I could stay another day, another week, but I would already be gone. Belonging is not measured by walls or roofs. It is measured by whether your presence still matters. The days began to blur together, each one marked by small, careful movements. I woke early, not because I had somewhere to be, but because sleeping felt like stealing time I no longer owned. I folded my blanket neatly every morning, as if someone might inspect the room and judge whether I deserved to stay one more night. I noticed how he spoke to me less. Not out of cruelty but convenience. Silence is easier than explanation. When words disappear, so does responsibility. I became a shadow moving through the house, careful not to interrupt conversations, laughter, plans that did not include me. Once I overheard him talking about a vacation, a place by the sea. His voice sounded light, almost excited. I smiled without meaning to. I had always loved the sea. I never told him that. Some things feel too small to mention until they are gone forever. I spent that afternoon going through the box of letters I had packed. Old handwriting, faded ink, promises written when life still felt open. I read them slowly, letting each word remind me that I had once been seen, chosen, loved without conditions. It comforted me more than I expected. For a brief moment, I wondered if this was my punishment for living too quietly. For never demanding, never asking, never insisting on my place. Maybe I had taught him that I could be moved, adjusted, removed. That thought hurt, but it also brought clarity. If I had been teaching him a lesson my whole life, then now it was time to teach myself one. That evening I made a decision. I would not wait for someone else to decide where I belonged. I would accept help if it was offered, but I would no longer ask for permission to exist. As I turned off the light, I felt tired in a new way. Not defeated. Just ready. Tomorrow I would take the next step. Even if my legs trembled while doing it. The days began to blur together, each one marked by small, careful movements. I woke early, not because I had somewhere to be, but because sleeping felt like stealing time I no longer owned. I folded my blanket neatly every morning, as if someone might inspect the room and judge whether I deserved to stay one more night. I noticed how he spoke to me less. Not out of cruelty but convenience. Silence is easier than explanation. When words disappear, so does responsibility. I became a shadow moving through the house, careful not to interrupt conversations, laughter, plans that did not include me. Once I overheard him talking about a vacation, a place by the sea. His voice sounded light, almost excited. I smiled without meaning to. I had always loved the sea. I never told him that. Some things feel too small to mention until they are gone forever. I spent that afternoon going through the box of letters I had packed. Old handwriting, faded ink, promises written when life still felt open. I read them slowly, letting each word remind me that I had once been seen, chosen, loved without conditions. It comforted me more than I expected. For a brief moment, I wondered if this was my punishment for living too quietly. For never demanding, never asking, never insisting on my place. Maybe I had taught him that I could be moved, adjusted, removed. That thought hurt, but it also brought clarity. If I had been teaching him a lesson my whole life, then now it was time to teach myself one. That evening I made a decision. I would not wait for someone else to decide where I belonged. I would accept help if it was offered, but I would no longer ask for permission to exist. As I turned off the light, I felt tired in a new way. Not defeated. Just ready. Tomorrow I would take the next step. Even if my legs trembled while doing it. The next morning I put on my coat and told him I was going out. He looked up briefly and nodded, already distracted by something on his screen. He didn't ask where I was going. That small detail stayed with me longer than it should have. Once he needed to know every step I took. Now my direction no longer mattered. I walked to the bus stop slowly, counting my breaths. The city felt larger than usual, louder, less forgiving. I watched people climb onto the bus with confidence, holding bags, plans, destinations. I held nothing but a folded piece of paper with an address written on it. A place someone had mentioned, a possibility, not a promise. The ride felt endless. Every stop reminded me that I could get off and turn back. That I could return to the familiar discomfort of being tolerated. But I stayed seated, my hands gripping my bag as if it were an anchor. When I finally arrived, the building looked ordinary. Clean. Quiet. Nothing dramatic. Just a place where lives paused instead of ending. I stood outside for a long moment, afraid to go in. Crossing that door felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to say out loud. that my life had narrowed, that my world had changed shape. Inside, a woman greeted me with a practiced smile. She spoke gently, asking simple questions. Her voice did not rush me. That alone nearly broke me. I wasn't used to being given time. As she explained procedures in rooms, I nodded just like I had learned to do. But this time my nod was different. It wasn't surrender. It was acknowledgement. When I stepped back outside, the air felt heavier but clearer. I hadn't decided anything yet. I had only looked, only considered. Still, it felt like progress. On the way home, I realized something quietly important. I had taken a step without telling him first, without waiting for approval. It was a small rebellion, but it was mine. When I returned to the house, it felt smaller than before, as if the walls had shifted while I was gone. He asked if everything was okay, but the question sounded automatic, like something learned rather than felt. I said yes. It was easier than explaining a truth he was no longer prepared to hear. I went to my room and sat on the bed, letting the quiet settle around me. For the first time, the thought of leaving did not make my chest tighten. Still hurt, yes, but the pain had changed its shape. It was no longer sharp. It was deep, steady, almost familiar. Like an old ache that reminds you of weather before it changes. I thought about the woman at the building I had visited. How she looked at me directly. How she waited for my answers without finishing my sentences for me. I realized how rare that had become in my life. Somewhere along the way, people stopped asking who I was and started deciding for me. That evening, I found myself humming while folding my clothes. The sound surprised me. It came out of nowhere, soft and unsure, but real. I couldn't remember the last time I had done that without noticing. Later, I heard him laughing again in the other room. The sound no longer pierced me the way it once had. I understood then that love doesn't always end with anger. Sometimes it ends with distance so quiet you only notice it once it's complete. I sat by the window and watched the lights outside turn on one by one. Lives unfolding, intersecting, continuing. Mine included. That realization felt strange, almost rebellious. I had spent so long existing as an extension of someone else that I forgot my life could still move forward. Before going to bed, I placed my packed bag closer to the door. Not dramatically, just practically. A signal to myself more than anyone else that I lay down and closed my eyes, breathing slowly that I was still afraid. But I was no longer lost, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to imagine a tomorrow that did not revel around him. The next day, he told me he had spoken to someone on my behalf. A friend of a friend. Someone who knew how these things worked. He said it like good news, like a favor done generously. I thanked him because that was expected of me, even though no one had asked what I wanted. He explained the plan carefully, outlining dates and arrangements. I listened, watching his mouth move, noticing how confident he sounded when talking about my future. It struck me how easily my life fit into his schedule. Between work meetings and family dinners, there was space to relocate me. I wanted to interrupt him, to say that I had already gone somewhere, that I had already asked questions, walked halls, imagined a different ending. But I didn't. Not yet. Something told me to keep that piece of myself protected a little longer. After he finished, he looked relieved, as if responsibility had been successfully transferred. I wondered if he believed this was kindness. Perhaps in his own way it was. But kindness without listening feels hollow, like a gesture made for the sake of one's conscience. Later, alone again, I sat on the bed and thought about choice. How rarely it had been mine. Marriage, motherhood, sacrifice. All roles I stepped into without complaint. I had believed that giving was enough, that it would circle back to me someday. Now, standing at the edge of another transition, I felt a quiet shift. I did not want decisions made about me anymore. I wanted them made by me, even if they were small, even if they led somewhere uncertain. That evening, I took out the paper with the address again and smoothed it carefully. The building returned to my mind, plain, quiet, steady. Not perfect, but honest. I placed the paper inside my bag and closed it slowly. This time, the sound did not feel like loss. Felt like intention. For the first time, I understood something clearly. Being old does not mean being finished. It only means the courage comes more quietly. I woke before sunrise, the house still asleep. The quiet felt different that morning. Not heavy, not tense, but almost respectful. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to my own breathing, steady and calm. I realized I had already made my decision somewhere during the night. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if I didn't want to wake the past. I washed my face, brushed my hair, chose clothes that made me feel like myself, not like someone waiting to be moved. Each small action felt meaningful, a way of reclaiming something I had given away too easily. In the kitchen, I poured myself tea and stood by the counter instead of sitting at the table. Sitting felt like waiting. Standing felt like readiness. I thought about leaving a note. Something gentle. Something forgiving. But no words came that felt honest. Any explanation would sound like justification, and I was done justifying my existence. Silence for once felt like my choice. I went back to the room and picked up my bag. It was heavier than before, not because I had added things but because I now understood what it carried. A lifetime of care. Of endurance. Of love that had nowhere left to go. Before leaving, I took one last look around. The walls were bare, indifferent. They had never known me, not really. I felt no urge to touch them, no need to say goodbye. As I opened the door, my hand trembled slightly. Not from fear, from the weight of stepping into something unknown. I paused, took a breath, and reminded myself that staying would have been the greater risk. I stepped out quietly and closed the door behind me. For a moment I stood there, unsure of where to place my feet. Then I took one step forward. Then another. I did not look back. Because some departures are not escapes. They are returns. To the self that learned, too late but not too late at all, that she deserved to choose. The air outside felt sharper, cleaner, as if the world had shifted just enough to notice me again. I walked slowly, adjusting the strap of my bag on my shoulder, feeling its weight settle into something familiar. Every step away from that house felt unreal, like walking out of a life I had rehearsed for years without knowing it. At the bus stop, I sat down carefully. My knees protested, reminding me of my age, of limits I could not ignore. I smiled at them sadly. Even now my body tried to warn me, but my heart was already ahead, already moving. People waited around me, strangers with headphones, shopping bags, tired eyes. None of them knew that I had just ended a chapter of my life. To them, I was just another old woman waiting for a bus. There was comfort in that. No pity. No questions. When the bus arrived, I hesitated for a second. Not because I wanted to go back, but because stepping on meant accepting that there would be no turning this into a misunderstanding. This was real. Final. I paid my fare and found a seat by the window. As the bus pulled away, houses and streets slipped past, carrying pieces of my past with them. I pressed my forehead lightly against the glass and let myself feel it all. The grief, the anger I never showed, the love that still existed despite everything. I wondered if he would notice my absence quickly or slowly, if he would feel relief or a brief sting of guilt. Then I stopped myself. His reaction was no longer my responsibility. I had carried enough weight for one lifetime. The building came into view sooner than I expected. It looked the same as before, ordinary, calm waiting. My chest tightened, but I breathed through it. Fear was allowed. Turning back was not. As I stepped off the bus, I realized something quietly powerful. For the first time in a long while, every step I took belonged only to me. And even though my hands were shaking, my back remained straight. Inside, the building smelled faintly of soap and warm air. Not like a hospital, not like a home, something in between. A place where time moved slower, more carefully. I stood near the entrance, unsure where to go, feeling suddenly very visible. Leaving invisibility behind is harder than it sounds. A woman approached me, the same one from before. She recognized me immediately. That alone made my throat tighten. Recognition is a powerful thing when you've grown used to being overlooked. She asked how I was, and for a moment I almost told the truth. Instead, I said I was ready to talk. We sat at a small desk. Papers appeared between us, neatly arranged. She explained things again, patiently, without rushing my answers. When I asked questions, she waited. She didn't interrupt. She didn't assume. I realized how starved I had been for that simple respect. She showed me a room. Small, clean, with a window that let in soft light. 2 beds. One empty. I imagined another woman there. Another story, another quiet survival. The thought didn't scare me. It felt shared. I ran my fingers over the blanket, testing its weight. I thought about how many nights I had lain awake feeling like an unwanted guest. This room did not promise happiness, but it did promise rest. That felt like enough for now. When she asked if I wanted to stay, my voice wavered. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because saying yes meant accepting the truth of everything that had happened. I nodded, then spoke clearly, surprising even myself. Yes, I would like that. She smiled, not brightly but warmly, as if she understood the cost of that word. Later, alone in the room, I sat on the bed and placed my bag beside me. I hadn't lost everything. I still had myself, my memories, my quiet strength. I looked out the window and whispered, not in bitterness but in honesty, "This is not where I thought my life would be." Then I added, just as softly, "But I am still here." That first night, sleep came in pieces. I woke often, disoriented by unfamiliar sounds, footsteps in the hallway, a soft cough from the other bed, the distant hum of voices behind closed doors. Each sound reminded me that I was no longer alone, yet not truly with anyone either. It was a strange balance, unsettling and comforting at the same time. The woman in the other bed introduced herself quietly in the dark. Her voice was thin but kind. We exchanged a few careful words, the way people do when they don't yet know how much of their story is safe to share. I didn't tell her why I was here. She didn't ask. Some truths don't need an audience. Lying there, I thought about the house I had left, about whether he had noticed the empty room, the missing bag, the absence of small sounds I used to make without realizing it. I pictured him standing there, confused for a moment, then moving on. The image hurt, but less than I expected. What surprised me most was the quiet relief spreading through my body. No one here expected anything from me. I didn't have to be useful. I didn't have to stay out of the way. I was allowed to simply exist. That permission felt heavier than responsibility, but also gentler. At some point, tears slipped out. Silent, unannounced. Not for him, for myself. For the years I had spent shrinking so others could feel comfortable. For the woman I had been before I learned to disappear. In the early hours of the morning, light began to seep through the window. Pale, hesitant. I watched it touch the wall, then the floor, then my hands folded on my chest. I was still breathing. Still here. Still capable of beginning again, even if the beginning was small and quiet. As the room slowly filled with day, I understood something simple and true. This place was not the end of my story. It was the pause I had never allowed myself to take. Morning came with soft knocks on doors and gentle voices in the hallway. I woke more rested than I had in weeks, surprised by the absence of tension in my shoulders. The ceiling above me was unfamiliar, but it did not feel threatening. Simply was. My roommate was already awake, sitting up carefully, folding her blanket with practiced movements. We exchanged a small smile. No words. There was comfort in that quiet understanding. Two lives meeting without pressure. At breakfast, I sat at a long table with others like me. Some spoke, some stared into their cups, some laughed too loudly, as if afraid silence might swallow them. I listened. I observed. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel like an intruder in someone else's routine. I was part of it, even if only gently. A nurse asked my name and how I slept. She waited for my answer. Again, that patience. I realized how much healing can happen in moments so small they are often ignored. Later, I walked slowly down the hallway, touching the railing for support. The walls were lined with pictures, landscapes, flowers, places meant to calm the mind. None of them reminded me of home, but that was all right. Home, I was learning, was not a fixed place anymore. I thought about calling him, just to say I was safe, just to remove any doubt. My hand hovered near my pocket, then fell back to my side. I wasn't ready, and maybe I didn't need to be. Communication should not always come from obligation. In the afternoon, I sat by the window and watched birds gather on a bare tree. They stayed close, shifting, waiting, then suddenly flew off together. I wondered if they ever questioned where they belonged. As evening approached, I felt something unfamiliar. Not happiness, not sadness, but stability. A quiet floor beneath my feet. For the first time since those words were spoken to me, I wasn't thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what I might still keep. That night, after dinner, the hallway grew quiet again. Doors closed softly, lights dimmed, and the building settled into its evening rhythm. I sat on my bed with my hands folded, listening to the slow ticking of time. Not rushing, not pushing me out. My roommate spoke a little more then. She told me about her children, about how busy they were, how life moved too fast for visits. She didn't sound angry, just tired. I recognized that tone immediately, the voice of someone who has already forgiven without being asked. I listened carefully, not interrupting, not correcting. Sometimes the greatest kindness is allowing another person to finish their truth. When she stopped, she looked at me as if expecting advice. I had none. Advice feels cheap when life has already decided for you. So I simply nodded and said, I understand. And I did. Deeply. Later, alone with my thoughts, I took out the old photograph from my bag. The one where I was young, holding him, my face full of certainty. I studied it under the soft light, not with pain this time but with distance. That woman did everything she could with what she knew then. She deserved compassion, not regret. I placed the photo back in the bag and closed it carefully. Some memories no longer need to be revisited every night. They can rest. Before turning off the light, I caught my reflection in the dark window. An old woman looked back at me, lined, quiet, changed. But there was something new in her eyes. Space. As if room had finally been made for her to exist without explanation. I lay down and pulled the blanket up to my chest. My body ached, my heart still carried scars, but neither defined me completely anymore. As sleep slowly approached, one thought stayed with me, steady and calm. I had been pushed out of one life, but I had not been pushed out of my own. The following days began to form a pattern. Not an exciting one, not a dramatic one, but a steady rhythm that held me without asking questions. Wake up. Washington, eat. Sit by the window. Walk a little. Rest. For the first time in years, no one hurried me through my own life. I noticed small things. How the light moved across the floor in the afternoon. How tea tasted better when I drank it slowly. How my hands shook less when I wasn't afraid of being seen as inconvenient. These details felt like quiet rewards for surviving something no one acknowledged out loud. One afternoon, a volunteer came to read to those who wanted to listen. I sat near the back, unsure. Her voice was calm, patient. As she read, I realized I hadn't let myself simply listen in a long time. I was always anticipating needs, reactions, problems. Letting words wash over me felt like setting something down I had carried for decades. Later I thought again about him. Not with anger. Not even with sadness. More like remembering a distant place I once lived. I wondered if he believed I was being taken care of now. If that belief allowed him to sleep better at night. So I hoped it did. Carrying guilt is heavy. I knew that well. In the common room, someone laughed suddenly. A sharp, bright sound that startled me. Then I found myself smiling. It felt unfamiliar on my face, like a muscle rediscovered. I didn't question it. I let it stay. That evening, I wrote a few lines in a small notebook I had found in my bag. Nothing important. Just observations. Proof that my days still existed. Before sleep, I realized something quietly extraordinary. No one here knew my past sacrifices, and yet I was still allowed to be. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps for now. It was everything. One morning I woke with a strange feeling in my chest. Not pain, not fear, but anticipation. It took me a moment to understand it. I was looking forward to the day. Not because something special was planned, but because nothing was expected of me. I dressed slowly and joined the others in the common room. Someone had placed fresh flowers on the table. Simple ones, nothing expensive. Their presence felt intentional, like a quiet reminder that beauty does not need permission to exist. A woman sat beside me and asked if I liked flowers. I told her I used to grow them when I was younger. We talked for a while, exchanging small memories. No explanations. No defenses. Just two people sharing pieces of themselves without fear of being a burden. Later, during a short walk outside, I felt the sun on my face and closed my eyes. For a brief moment I forgot my age. I forgot why I was here. I was simply a woman standing in the light. That moment stayed with me longer than I expected. In the afternoon I found myself thinking less about what I had lost and more about what remained. My ability to notice, to feel, to choose kindness without sacrificing myself. These were not small things. I realized then that I had been mourning not just my place in my son's home, but an idea that my worth depended on being needed. Here I was not needed, and yet I was not invisible. That truth reshaped something inside me. That evening I sat by the window again, watching the sky turn soft and pale. I felt tired, but it was a good tired. The kind that comes from living honestly even in small ways. I whispered to myself, barely audible, I am still becoming. And for the first time I believed it. That afternoon, a nurse handed me a phone and said there was a call for me. For a moment my heart stumbled, as if it already knew who it might be. I hesitated before taking it, feeling the weight of possibilities settle in my palm. It was him. His voice sounded careful, unsure. He asked where I was, why I had left without saying anything. There was concern there, real or rehearsed, I couldn't tell. I told him calmly that I was safe, that I was staying somewhere for now. I did not explain further. There was a pause. I could almost hear him thinking, searching for the right words. He said he hadn't meant to hurt me, that things had just become complicated. I listened without interrupting, the way I always had. But something was different now. His words no longer defined me. When he asked if I was okay, I surprised us both by answering honestly. I am learning to be, I said. My voice did not shake. He went quiet again. Perhaps he expected tears, or gratitude, or reassurance that he was still a good son. I gave him none of those things. Not out of cruelty, but out of truth. Before the call ended, he said I could come back if I wanted. The words came late, heavy with obligation rather than desire. I thanked him gently and said I was where I needed to be. When I handed the phone back, my hands were steady. My heart was loud but not broken. I had faced the voice that once ruled my world, and it no longer held power over me. That evening I sat alone for a while, letting the emotions rise and settle. There was sadness, yes, but there was also relief. Some doors close without being slammed, and some reopen only to show you that you no longer wish to enter. I went to bed that night knowing something important had shifted, not in him, but in me. After the call, I expected the old feelings to return. Guilt, doubt, the familiar urge to reconsider everything. Instead, there was only a quiet heaviness, like the echo of something that had already passed. I sat with it, letting it exist without trying to fix it. My roommate noticed I was quieter than usual and asked if everything was all right. I told her I had spoken to my son. She nodded slowly, understanding more than I had said. There are some stories that don't need details. Age teaches you that. Later, during lunch, I watched people around me eat, talk, complain, laugh. Ordinary life unfolding in small ways. I realized I wasn't observing from the outside anymore. I was inside the moment, part of it. That shift felt subtle but profound. In the afternoon, I joined a small activity. Nothing special, just sorting old photographs donated by families. As I held each picture, I thought about how every face had once been central to someone's world. Loved, needed, remembered, then over time gently set aside. The thought didn't frighten me. It felt honest. One photo showed a woman standing proudly in her garden, hands on her hips, smiling at the camera. I smiled back at her. I wondered if anyone remembered how strong she had been. That evening I wrote again in my notebook. This time I wrote about myself, not as a mother, not as someone's responsibility, but simply as a woman who had lived, endured, and was still capable of noticing beauty. Before sleep I looked out the window one last time. The sky was dark, scattered with faint stars. I felt small but not insignificant. I understood then that reconciliation does not always mean return. Sometimes it means peace without closeness, acceptance without forgetting. And that, too, is a kind of love. Time moved differently now. Not faster, not slower, just kinder. Days no longer felt like something to survive. They arrived, unfolded, and ended without demanding proof of my worth. One morning I woke with a clear thought. I am no longer waiting. Not for apologies. Not for explanations. Not for someone to suddenly realize what I meant to them. That realization settled into me like warm tea on a cold day. I began helping a little, watering plants, folding towels, sitting with those who needed company. Not because I was expected to, but because I wanted to. There is a difference. Choice changes the weight of everything. A nurse once thanked me for my help and called me strong. The word caught me off guard. I had never thought of myself that way. I had always confused endurance with duty, silence with patience. Now I understood. Strength can be quiet and still belong to you. In the afternoon I received a letter. Not from him, from myself in a way. It was something I had written earlier and forgotten. A list of things I still enjoyed. Simple things. Warm bread. Morning light. Being listened to. I smiled, surprised by how much life still fit on that page. I thought about the woman I used to be. The one who believed love meant staying no matter the cost. I did not judge her. She did the best she could with what she knew. But I was no longer her. As evening came, I sat by the window again, watching the sky soften. I felt a quiet pride rise in me. Not loud, not boastful. Just steady. I had lost a place in someone else's life. But I had found my place in my own. And that discovery felt like something no one could ever take away. One evening, as I was helping set the tables for dinner, I caught my reflection in a glass cabinet. For a moment, I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. She stood straighter. Her eyes were calmer. There was a softness there. Not weakness, but acceptance. I realized I hadn't seen myself clearly in years. That night, I dreamed of my younger self. Not as a mother, not as a wife, but as a woman walking alone down a long road. She wasn't afraid. She didn't rush. She simply walked, trusting that the road would hold her. When I woke, the feeling stayed with me, warm and steady. The next day I received a small package. Inside was a sweater I had left behind, sent without a note. I held it for a long time, feeling the familiar fabric under my fingers. There was no anger in me, only a quiet understanding. Some people return objects when they cannot return care. I folded the sweater and placed it in my drawer. Not as a reminder of loss, but as proof of how far I had come. Once that gesture would have reopened wounds. Now it barely brushed them. In the afternoon, I sat with my roommate as she rested. She reached for my hand without looking, trusting it would be there. I let her hold it. In that simple moment I felt something deep and human. Connection without obligation. Presence without fear. As evening settled, I realized I was no longer measuring my days by what might happen next. I was living inside them. Fully. Honestly. I thought of him one last time that night. Not with pain, not with longing, but with distance gentle enough to breathe. I wished him well, silently, without sacrificing myself in the process. Some endings are loud and dramatic. Mine was quiet. And in that quiet, I had finally learned how to stay. With myself. On my last evening of that first month, I sat by the window as I always did and watched the lights come on one by one. I realized I was no longer counting days since I had left. Time had stopped being something I measured by loss. I thought about my life, not just the years of giving but the moments of strength I never named. The mornings I stood up when it would have been easier to stay quiet. The nights I survived without being held. The love I gave freely, even when it was not returned the way I had hoped. None of it was wasted. It shaped me into someone who could still stand, still choose, still feel. I understood then that my story was never only about being sent away. It was about arriving somewhere new. Not just in this place but inside myself. I had crossed an invisible line. I was no longer defined by rejection. Later, I lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the building settling for the night. A cough. A door closing. Soft footsteps in the hall. Life continuing, quietly including me. I placed my hand on my chest and felt my heartbeat, steady and sure. I was not waiting anymore. Not for forgiveness. Not for validation. Not for someone to tell me I mattered. I already knew. If my son ever remembers me, I hope it is not with guilt but with truth. And if he never does, I will still be here, living gently, honestly, fully. This was not the ending I imagined, but it was the ending I chose. And that made all the difference.